Good evening, everybody. Good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I'm filling in with a friend of mine for Ralph Winterrowd, who will be back next week. Ralph's taking a break this week to go and watch some of the football that's going on this weekend, apparently. Something which I know nothing about, so I can't comment. And I have with me Dr. Judy Wood, who is in the USA too, but I'm in the UK, and we're going to be talking primarily about things related to 9/11 tonight, but we may branch off into some other areas too. We will take some calls later on, and there may be some people who know the call-in number, which I'll read out shortly, but you can hang fire with the calls because we're going to cover some other things first. And I think what I'm going to do is, until the music fades in, I'm going to start reading a passage which I thought was appropriate as a kind of background to some of what we're going to talk about today. And it's actually by a chap called Ralph Winterrowd, who wrote a book in the 1990s called NASA Mooned America, which is all about how the moon landings were basically, a hoax and were faked, and he goes through a lot of evidence. But before he goes through that evidence, he actually has a preface and an introduction, and this is part of that introduction. And he writes in his book, "Over a decade ago, I wrote a column called One Man's Opinion for my local North Jersey Mensa newsletter, Imprint. At the local level, Mensa is primarily a social organisation, but the qualification for membership is to score in the top 2 percentile of the population on standard intelligence tests. The North Jersey group used to put out a good newsletter, but I soon discovered that whenever I attacked some sacred cow, particularly a scientific sacred cow, vitriolic, knee-jerk responses were triggered from people who were certifiably intelligent. I finally came to realize that my fellow Mensans were just as subject to failures in logic as are the rest of humankind, myself included. Our, brackets, what I call emotional belief system, or EBS, is the sum total of our inner philosophy. This evolves from the sum total of our life experiences. Our personal philosophies are basically emotional, because much of what we believe is not necessarily logical. Indeed, it may even be contradictory, but nonetheless we make our decisions and govern our lives accordingly. Our EBS is implanted in our early childhood by cultural osmosis and authoritarian pronouncements. We are imprinted by our society's opinions in the same way a baby duck is imprinted by the first moving object it sees after hatching. Much of this imprinting is due to religion, which is one of the great moulders of societies. Then add our early education, what we are taught or not taught, and our parents' influence. This is the process by which we eventually come to know right from wrong, good from evil, success from failure, and stool from shinola and shoe polish. Have you ever wondered how a man from a third world country wearing a pair of tattered trousers can be so pleased with himself, even though his ribs stand out from hunger? How can he feel so fine, knowing that the great number of children he has sired will be as dirt poor as he is? The reason is that in his society the very act of siring marks him the success he is. Logical? No. Emotionally satisfying? Yes. Our EBS is reinforced by education, most of which takes place before our critical faculties develop or our logic centres mature. Our imprinted opinions can vary from era to era, from country to country, or from county to county. These influences cause our philosophies to vary according to sex, religion, status, occupation, or even physical and mental attributes. As I said before, EBS represents the sum total of our lives. No two lives are identical, so the fringe layers of our inner philosophies are as individualistic as our fingerprints. But unlike our prints, which are fixed at birth, our personal philosophy can and does change somewhat as a response to each day's new experiences being filtered and compared against the old. And that, as I say, was from a book called NASA Mooned America by Ralph Winterrowd. Those weren't my words. And it's basically, to me, quite a good way of describing describing the reasons, really, when we start to talk about some of the topics we're going to talk about tonight, or some of the topics that Ralph talks about. People just can't handle it. They can't take in what we're saying. They look at us with strange expressions, and, we really can't get across what we're trying to convey to them. We cannot get that across. I'd like to now bring in Dr. Judy Wood, who is with me on the line, and I wondered if you've got any response to that. We may get cut into by the music.
Yes, I'd like to comment. That is really a great thing that you read. I'd like to add to it, though, the sense of conformity. That people tend to conform, and they assume that what everyone else is doing must be right. And they just bend to that, what they think is... otherwise, why do we have fashion? Right.
And I think, one of the things we found is, we don't conform in a number of ways, particularly in, what we've come to know about 9/11, for example, where a large proportion of the population conforms to what they think is, what they've been told, basically. But then we've also encountered, in what we've been doing in the last 7 or 8 years now, a new kind of conformity that's been put into place, which is essentially, you could call it the 9/11 truth movement. And people within that group feel that they have to conform to what other people are now putting out. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that, in that we've got some updates to what we talked about. Well, I think it was almost a year ago now, when Dr. Wood and myself did a similar thing, and we filled in for Ralph. And there's been a few developments since that time, which I'm going to talk about. But I think it's basically to do with covering up the truth of 9/11. And there are, for people that have not heard me speak before, and heard Dr. Wood speak before, there are essentially two layers of cover-up in relation to 9/11. The first layer of the cover-up is the official story, with the Bin Laden story and the planes crashing into the towers and the hijackers and all that nonsense. And when you begin to scratch into that story, it very quickly falls apart, as I began to discover in 2003. But then once you scratch through that, you encounter another layer of cover-up, which is populated by... It's populated by, well, really some quite strange people that you find out that seem to have a very strange agenda, in that you initially come into this, as I did, thinking that you're dealing with people that want to know the truth, and they're willing to carry on looking for the truth, even when they think, even when they think they might have initially found it. You can show them something which proves that what they originally thought cannot be true. And you go through this kind of weird process whereby I have people that I once counted as friends. They knew that the official story of 9/11 was false, but when I tried to explain to them what I'd now come to understand, they weren't interested. So we're going to go for a break now. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the universe. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I am filling in for Ralph Winterrowd, who will be back next week, and I'm with Dr. Judy Wood. And we are primarily talking about 9/11, because that's an area of research that we've spent a lot of time involved with. And in the introductory segment, I'd read out a piece by Ralph Winterrowd, who'd written a book about the Apollo moon hoax. And it's interesting to note that when I did a discussion on this on a UK TV program, I actually got more emails about the Apollo program that we did than I did about any of the other topics, including 9/11. So it's one of these areas which really seems to touch a very strong nerve with people. I think
it's filled with belief.
Yeah. And I think it's in common with 9/11. A lot of the information is put forward as if it's scientific, but when you actually get down to it, it's based on belief.